Sarah bustled through the first-class cabin, her mind racing with the day's tasks. She quickly checked each seat, ensuring everything was in order for the upcoming flight from New York to Los Angeles. As she worked, she noticed Marcus, a well-dressed black man, confidently striding down the aisle. Instantly, her mind filled with preconceived notions and judgments. And if you love your family and want to hear more incredible stories like this one, subscribe to our channel. As passengers began boarding, Marcus approached the counter with a polite smile. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth and professional. "I was wondering if it might be possible to upgrade my economy seat to first class." Sarah's response was immediate and firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but our policy doesn't allow for last-minute upgrades. You'll need to keep your assigned seat." The air grew thick with tension as other passengers observed the exchange. An elderly woman seated nearby raised her hand, her eyes sharp with disapproval. "Excuse me, dear," she called out to Sarah. "Why exactly can't this gentleman have a seat up here? There seem to be plenty available." Sarah felt her cheeks flush as she fumbled for a response. "As I said, it's company policy. We can't make exceptions." The elderly woman's eyebrows shot up. "Company policy? Or is there another reason you're denying this man a seat?" The implication hung heavy in the air, and Sarah felt her stomach churn. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Other passengers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, the atmosphere growing more charged by the second. Marcus stood silently, his expression a mixture of resignation and disappointment. He'd been in similar situations before, but it never got easier. Sarah, feeling the weight of judgmental stares, tried to busy herself with other tasks, hoping the moment would pass. But the seed of discomfort had been planted, and it was clear this flight was about to become much more than a simple journey from coast to coast. The tension in the cabin continued to escalate. A young mother, cradling her infant, locked eyes with the elderly woman who had first spoken up. Gathering her courage, she raised her voice. "I know exactly how this feels," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just last month, I was denied service at a restaurant because they said my baby would disturb other customers." She looked directly at Sarah, who shifted uncomfortably. "It's not right to judge people based on appearances or assumptions." Sarah felt her chest tighten. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that this wasn't about race or discrimination, but about following rules. Yet, as she looked around at the faces of the passengers, she saw a mix of anger, disappointment, and knowing nods. She busied herself with checking seatbelts, trying to ignore the growing murmurs of discontent. Marcus, sensing the hostility building towards Sarah, decided to take a different approach. He cleared his throat, drawing attention. "You know, this reminds me of something that happened to me last year," he began, his voice calm and measured. "I was at a crucial business meeting, pitching a multi-million-dollar deal. I'd prepared for months, and I knew my proposal was solid." The cabin grew quiet as passengers leaned in to listen. "I walked into that boardroom and you should have seen their faces," Marcus continued. "It was clear they weren't expecting someone who looked like me. One executive even asked if I was in the right room." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "I had to work twice as hard to prove myself, to show them that my ideas and my capabilities weren't defined by the color of my skin." As Marcus spoke, Sarah found herself listening despite her initial reluctance. She'd never considered how such experiences might shape a person's life, how they might affect every interaction, every request for equal treatment. Other passengers began nodding, some even sharing brief anecdotes of their own experiences with discrimination. The atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. What had started as a confrontation was evolving into a moment of shared understanding. Sarah, still silent, felt a growing unease. She'd made a snap judgment about Marcus, and now she was forced to confront the possibility that her actions were part of a much larger, more painful pattern. A middle-aged man in a crisp military uniform had been observing the unfolding situation with increasing concern. He leaned forward, his voice carrying authority as he addressed the cabin. "Folks, I think we need to take a step back here," he said. "I've served alongside people from all walks of life, and I can tell you this. Judging someone based on appearance or background is not only wrong, it's dangerous." The ex-military man's intervention caught everyone's attention, including Sarah's. She found herself listening intently as he continued. "In the field, we learn quickly that it's not about where you come from or what you look like. It's about character, skill, and mutual respect. Those are the things that matter when your life is on the line." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces around him. "I remember a mission in Afghanistan," he said, his voice softening. "We were pinned down, outnumbered. The soldier who saved our lives that day? He looked nothing like me, came from a completely different world. But in that moment, none of that mattered. We were brothers, united by a common purpose." As the ex-soldier spoke, Sarah felt a growing discomfort. She'd always prided herself on being professional and fair, but now she was forced to confront the possibility that her actions had been neither. The stories she was hearing were opening her eyes to experiences she'd never considered. "After I returned home," the ex-soldier continued, "I made it my mission to promote understanding and inclusion wherever I could, because I've seen firsthand what happens when we let our prejudices divide us." He looked directly at Sarah, his gaze not accusatory, but challenging. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit when we're wrong and be willing to change." Sarah felt her defenses crumbling. She thought about her own past, the challenges she'd faced as a woman in a male-dominated industry. How often had she felt underestimated or overlooked? Yet she realized with a pang of guilt she'd just done the same thing to Marcus. The cabin had fallen silent, the air heavy with reflection. Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She could continue to hide behind rules and procedures, or she could take this moment as an opportunity for growth. As she looked around at the faces of the passengers, each with their own stories and struggles, she felt something shift inside her. Suddenly, the plane shuddered violently. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," a voice crackled over the intercom. "We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts immediately." The cabin erupted into a flurry of activity as passengers scrambled to secure themselves. Sarah snapped into professional mode, moving swiftly through the cabin to ensure everyone was safely seated. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice how the earlier tension had given way to a shared sense of vulnerability. Strangers, who had been eyeing each other with suspicion moments ago, were now offering reassuring smiles and steady hands to those struggling with their seatbelts. The young mother with the infant looked particularly distressed, trying to calm her crying baby while securing herself. Without hesitation, an elderly gentleman sitting nearby offered to hold the child. "I raised 4 of my own," he said with a kind smile. "Let me help you get settled." The mother gratefully accepted, and soon the baby was cooing contentedly in the man's arms. As the turbulence intensified, Sarah found herself near Marcus's seat. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the earlier confrontation hung between them. Then Marcus spoke, his voice calm despite the plane's jolting. "Are you all right?" he asked Sarah. She was taken aback by his concern, especially after how she had treated him. "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah managed to reply, her voice shaky. She hesitated, then added, I'm sorry about earlier. I shouldn't have." Marcus raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "Now's not the time," he said. "Let's just focus on getting through this turbulence safely, all right?" Sarah nodded, a lump forming in her throat. As she moved on to check on other passengers, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The artificial barriers of class and race that had seemed so important earlier now felt trivial in the face of their shared humanity. and the very real danger they were all facing together. As the plane continued to shake, Sarah made her way back to her station, her mind racing. She looked at the diverse group of passengers, all united in this moment of uncertainty, and felt a deep sense of shame for her earlier behavior. She realized that she had an opportunity here, not just to make things right with Marcus, but to learn and grow from this experience. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made a decision. Once the turbulence passed, she would approach Marcus. She would listen to his story, truly listen, without judgment or defensiveness. It was time to confront her own biases and preconceptions head-on. As the turbulence subsided, Sarah gathered her courage and approached Marcus. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice hesitant. "I was wondering if you might have a moment to talk." Marcus looked up, surprise flickering across his face before he nodded, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. Sarah sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier," she began. "And, if you're willing, I'd like to hear more about your experiences. The story you mentioned earlier, about the business meeting. Could you tell me more?" Marcus studied her for a moment, as if gauging her sincerity. Then he began to speak. "It wasn't just one meeting," he said. "It's been a constant struggle throughout my career. I've had to work twice as hard, be twice as prepared, just to be taken seriously." He went on to describe a particularly challenging period when he was trying to secure funding for his startup. "I had a solid business plan, a prototype that was outperforming competitors, and a team of brilliant minds behind me," Marcus explained. "But time and again, I'd walk into those boardrooms and see the doubt in their eyes. One investor even asked if I was the help when I arrived for our meeting." Sarah listened, her chest tightening with each word. She'd had no idea of the constant barriers and judgments Marcus faced. "How did you overcome it?" she asked softly. Marcus's expression softened. "I refused to let their prejudices define me," he said. "I kept pushing, kept proving myself. And eventually, I found investors who saw beyond the color of my skin to the value of my ideas. Now, my company is thriving, and we're making a real difference in our industry." As Marcus spoke, Sarah felt a deep sense of shame wash over her. She realized that her earlier refusal wasn't just about following rules. It was rooted in unconscious biases she hadn't even recognized in herself. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never considered... I didn't think..." Marcus held up a hand, his expression kind. "The important thing is that you're listening now," he said. "That's the first step towards change." Sarah nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "Thank you for sharing your story with me," she said. "I promise you I'm going to do better, not just with you, but with every passenger I interact with from now on." As their conversation continued, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She was embarking on a journey of self-discovery and growth, one that would challenge her. The ex-military man, who had been observing Sarah and Marcus's conversation from a few rows back, saw an opportunity to build on the moment of understanding that was unfolding. He stood up, addressing the cabin with a gentle but commanding voice. "Folks," he began, drawing everyone's attention, "I think we've all witnessed something powerful here today. What say we take it a step further? I propose we each share a lesson we've learned in our lives about overcoming prejudice or discrimination, something that's made us better, more understanding people." There was a moment of hesitation, then a murmur of agreement spread through the cabin. The elderly woman who had first challenged Sarah raised her hand. "I'll start," she said. "I grew up in a time and place where segregation was the norm. It wasn't until I traveled abroad in my 30s that I realized how narrow my worldview had been. Meeting people from all walks of life opened my eyes to the richness of human diversity. Her words seemed to break a dam. One by one, passengers began to share their stories. A young man spoke about coming out as gay in a conservative small town and how the unexpected support of his football coach had changed his life. A woman in a hijab described the challenges she faced in the workplace and how a colleague's willingness to listen and learn had created a ripple effect of understanding throughout their office. As the stories continued, Sarah listened intently, her earlier defensiveness completely dissolved. She was struck by the courage of these strangers, opening up about their vulnerabilities and triumphs. Each tale was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of empathy to bridge divides. Marcus shared a story about mentoring young entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds, describing the joy of seeing them succeed against the odds. Every time one of those kids lands a big contract or launches a successful product, he said, it's a victory not just for them, but for everyone who's ever been underestimated. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. What had started as a tense, uncomfortable situation had become a moment of collective growth and understanding. Strangers were nodding in recognition of shared experiences, offering words of support and encouragement to one another. As the sharing came to a natural close, Sarah felt a profound shift within herself. She realized that her role as a flight attendant was about more than just serving drinks and ensuring safety protocols were followed. It was about creating an environment of respect and inclusion for every passenger, regardless of their background or appearance. Silently, she made a vow to herself. From this moment forward, she would approach her job with a new level of awareness and empathy. She would be an advocate for inclusivity, using her position to ensure that every passenger felt valued and respected. The journey ahead would not be easy, but Sarah was committed to making a difference, one flight at a time. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Sarah found herself lost in thought. The past few hours had been a whirlwind of emotions and revelations, challenging everything she thought she knew about herself and her role as a flight attendant. She moved through the cabin, preparing for landing, but her actions were on autopilot as her mind raced with newfound awareness. She caught glimpses of the passengers who had shared their stories, the elderly woman who had traveled the world, the young gay man from a small town, the woman in the hijab who had faced workplace discrimination. Each face now held a story, a struggle, a triumph. Sarah realized that every person who boarded her flights had similar depth, similar experiences that she had never bothered to consider before. As she secured the last overhead compartment, Sarah felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Marcus standing there, a warm smile on his face. "I wanted to thank you," he said softly, "for listening, for being open to change. It's not easy to confront our own biases, but it's the only way we grow." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "No, thank you," she replied. "You could have just been angry with me, and you would have been justified. Instead, you took the time to share your experiences, to help me understand. I can't tell you how much that means to me." Marcus nodded, his eyes kind. "We're all on a journey of learning and growth," he said. "The important thing is to keep moving forward, to be willing to change. Promise me you'll continue this journey, Sarah. Not just for yourself, but for every passenger who comes through those doors." "I promise," Sarah said, her voice firm with newfound determination. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure every person on my flights feels respected and valued." As Marcus returned to his seat, Sarah took a deep breath. The plane was touching down, but for her, it felt like a new beginning. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing ingrained habits and confronting deep-seated biases was going to be a constant challenge, but she was ready for it. The landing gear engaged with a gentle thud, and Sarah braced herself against the galley wall. As the plane taxied to the gate, she made a silent vow to herself. From this moment on, she would approach every interaction with openness and empathy. She would be an advocate for inclusivity in her workplace, even if it meant challenging her colleagues or superiors. As the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Sarah took a deep breath. She felt lighter, yet at the same time, the weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders. The passengers began to gather their belongings, and Sarah watched as they interacted with each other, smiling and chatting as if they were old friends rather than strangers who had just shared a transformative experience. Sarah made her way to the exit, ready to bid farewell to the passengers. As each person passed, she looked them in the eye, offering a genuine smile and a heartfelt, "Thank you for flying with us." It was a small gesture, but it felt different now. Each "thank you" carried the weight of her newfound understanding and commitment to change. When Marcus approached, Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Marcus," she said, her voice steady, "I want you to know that this flight has changed me. I'm going to do better, be better. Thank you for your patience and your willingness to educate me." Marcus nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. "Remember, Sarah," he said quietly, "true change begins with acknowledging our mistakes. Keep learning, keep growing, and most importantly, share what you've learned with others. That's how we make a real difference." As Marcus disappeared down the jet bridge, Sarah turned her attention to the remaining passengers. She felt a renewed sense of purpose. Each interaction was an opportunity to practice empathy, to challenge her own assumptions, and to create a more inclusive environment. The last passenger exited, and Sarah began her post-flight duties. As she moved through the now empty cabin, she reflected on the journey she had just begun. It wouldn't be easy, she knew. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and likely resistance from others, but she was committed to this path. Sarah gathered her belongings, preparing to disembark. She paused at the aircraft door, taking one last look at the cabin that had been the setting for such a profound change in her life. With a deep breath, she stepped onto the jet bridge, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead in her quest to become a better, more inclusive flight attendant and human being. As Sarah made her way through the terminal, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The events of the flight replayed in her mind, each moment a reminder of the transformation she had undergone. She watched as passengers from her flight dispersed, some hurrying to catch connecting flights, others reuniting with loved ones at the arrivals area. What struck her most was the way these passengers interacted with each other. There was a warmth, a sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there at the beginning of the flight. She saw the elderly woman who had first spoken up sharing contact information with the young mother. The ex-military man was engaged in an animated conversation with a group of younger passengers, likely sharing more of his experiences. As Sarah approached the crew exit, she spotted Marcus one last time. He was standing near the baggage claim, deep in conversation with a young man who seemed to be hanging on his every word. Sarah couldn't help but smile, imagining Marcus sharing his wisdom and experiences, perhaps mentoring another aspiring entrepreneur. Just as she was about to leave, Marcus looked up and caught her eye. He gave her a small nod and a smile that spoke volumes. It was a gesture of encouragement, a silent reminder of the promise she had made to herself and to him. Sarah nodded back, feeling a renewed sense of determination. As she pushed through the door marked "Crew Only," Sarah took a deep breath. The real test would come now as she faced her colleagues and superiors. How would she explain the events of the flight? More importantly, how would she begin to implement the changes she knew were necessary? Sarah made her way to the crew lounge, her mind racing with ideas. She could suggest diversity training for all flight attendants, or perhaps initiate a mentorship program to support employees from underrepresented backgrounds. The possibilities were endless, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt genuinely excited about her job and the potential for positive change. As she entered the lounge, she was greeted by curious looks from her fellow flight attendants. News of the incident had clearly spread. Sarah straightened her shoulders, ready to face whatever questions or criticisms might come her way. She knew that this was just the beginning of her journey, but she was ready for the challenge. "Everything okay, Sarah?" one of her colleagues asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Sarah paused, considering her words carefully. "Actually," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination, "I think everything's about to get a whole lot better." Sarah barely had time to catch her breath before she was summoned to the supervisor's office. As she walked down the narrow hallway, her heart raced with a mix of anxiety and determination. She knew this conversation wouldn't be easy, but she was prepared to stand her ground. As she entered the office, Sarah was met with the stern gaze of her supervisor, Ms. Thompson. "Sarah, take a seat," Ms. Thompson said, her voice clipped. "I've received some concerning reports about your behavior on the last flight. Care to explain?" Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Ms. Thompson, I made a mistake today," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I let my biases affect how I treated a passenger, and it led to a tense situation. But what happened next was transformative." Ms. Thompson's eyebrows shot up. "Transformative? Sarah, we have protocols in place for a reason. You can't just decide to ignore company policy because you had some sort of epiphany." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes earnest. "I'm not suggesting we ignore policy," she explained. "I'm saying we need to re-examine our approach to customer service. Today, I learned firsthand how our unconscious biases can impact our interactions with passengers. And I believe we have an opportunity, no, a responsibility, to do better." Ms. Thompson's expression remained skeptical, but Sarah pressed on. She recounted the events of the flight, the stories shared by passengers, and the profound impact it had on everyone involved, including herself. As she spoke, she could see a flicker of interest in her supervisor's eyes. "I understand your concerns," Sarah concluded, "but I truly believe this could be a turning point for our airline. We have the chance to lead the industry in inclusive customer service. Imagine the positive impact we could have, not just on our passengers, but on our staff and our company's reputation." There was a long pause as Ms. Thompson considered Sarah's words. Finally, she spoke. "Sarah, I appreciate your honesty and your passion, but this is a complex issue. I can't just overhaul our policies based on one flight's experience." Sarah nodded, undeterred. "I understand. But could we at least start a conversation? Perhaps we could form a committee to review our current practices and suggest improvements?" Ms. Thompson sighed, but there was a hint of a smile on her face. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Sarah replied, a small smile of her own forming. "I believe this is too important to ignore." "All right," Ms. Thompson conceded. "I'll look into it. But Sarah, understand that change takes time, and you'll need to be patient and work within our system." As Sarah left the office, she felt a mix of relief and anticipation. It wasn't a resounding victory, but it was a start. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready to face it. The lessons she had learned on that flight from New York to Los Angeles would guide her as she worked to create a more inclusive and empathetic environment for all passengers and crew members. A week after the transformative flight, Sarah found herself in a company-wide meeting, her heart pounding with anticipation. Ms. Thompson had called the gathering to address recent events and discuss the airline's approach to customer service. As the room filled with flight attendants, pilots, and administrative staff, Sarah could feel the tension in the air. Whispers and curious glances were directed her way. Clearly, word of her experience had spread. Ms. Thompson cleared her throat, silencing the room. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her tone serious. "We're here to discuss a recent incident that has brought to light some important issues regarding our customer service policies and practices." Sarah held her breath as Ms. Thompson recounted the events of the flight, careful not to mention names but providing enough detail for everyone to understand the gravity of the situation. She then revealed that a formal complaint had been filed against Sarah by a passenger who had witnessed her initial interaction with Marcus. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame. But before she could dwell on it, Ms. Thompson continued. "However," she said, her voice cutting through the whispers, "we've also received an unprecedented number of positive comments about this same flight. Passengers have praised the crew, particularly Sarah, for fostering an environment of openness, understanding, and mutual respect." Sarah's head snapped up in surprise. She hadn't expected this. "In light of these events," Ms. Thompson continued, "we've decided to take a hard look at our policies and training programs. We want to ensure that we're not just providing good service, but truly inclusive and empathetic service." As Ms. Thompson outlined plans for new diversity and inclusion training, Sarah felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see the ex-military passenger from her flight, now dressed in a pilot's uniform. "Captain Rogers?" He introduced himself with a warm smile. "I was on your flight last week. I wanted you to know that I've submitted a formal commendation for your handling of the situation. Your courage in admitting your mistake and your commitment to growth are exactly what we need in this industry." Before Sarah could respond, Ms. Thompson's voice cut through again. "We have a special guest today," she announced. "Mr. Marcus Jennings, a passenger from the flight in question, has agreed to share his perspective with us." Sarah's jaw dropped as Marcus walked to the front of the room. He nodded at her, a small smile playing on his lips, before addressing the crowd. "What happened on that flight was unfortunate," Marcus began, "but it was also an opportunity for growth, for learning, and for change. Sarah's initial mistake could have ended badly. Instead, it became a catalyst for one of the most meaningful experiences I've had while traveling." As Marcus shared his side of the story, emphasizing the positive outcome and the lessons learned, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She realized that her journey wasn't just about personal growth. It was about inspiring change on a larger scale. When Marcus finished speaking, Ms. Thompson took the floor again. "In light of these events, we're establishing a new inclusivity and customer experience task force," she announced, "and I'd like Sarah to lead it." The room erupted in applause, and Sarah felt overwhelmed with emotion. As her colleagues congratulated her, she caught Marcus's eye. He gave her a thumbs up, mouthing the words, "Keep going." Sarah nodded, feeling a surge of determination. This was just the beginning. She had a long road ahead, but she was ready to face it, armed with the lessons she'd learned and the support of those around her. The flight from New York to Los Angeles had been more than just a journey across the country. It had been the start of a movement, a commitment to fostering understanding, empathy, and inclusivity in the skies and beyond.